Was originally on the question of the oil price increase. Comments on the topic that Tony just included at the beginning of his talk, and that is what happened in France with the magazine Charlie Hebdo. So I wrote it out, and especially for the benefit of people who may have come in later and not even heard what the comrade before me said. I'm going to just go ahead as though you haven't heard this. First of all, I wanted to say Black Lives Matter, and something like that should be universally recognized. They're taken for granted, of course. Of course, Black Lives Matter. However, what should be self-evident to everybody has to be fought for. And at last, we have the rise of this wonderful new movement to shake up the racist status quo. But the same thing goes for other manifestations of national oppression. Don't Arab lives matter? Don't Muslim lives matter? And remember when Ebola looked like it might spread to the US and Europe? Then it was front page news. Well, it hasn't spread here, but it continues to claim thousands of lives in West Africa. But Ebola's not in the headlines anymore. What's the not so subtle message? African lives don't matter. When the US drones wipe out a wedding party in Pakistan, or their artillery obliterate a village in Afghanistan, is it news? When Al-Qaeda or the Nusra Front kill people in Syria or the Kurdish areas, the main concern expressed here is how this will affect Washington's plans for the area. The Muslim lives don't matter. When the US invaded Iraq with shock and awe, when it provided planes and funding to bring down the Libyan government, when it supplies the opposition, as they call it, in Syria to kill tens of thousands and displace millions of people, it's treated like a footnote. Doesn't matter. But when some group, and we really don't know who they are, carries out a bloody attack on a newspaper in Paris, then every columnist here and in all the imperialist world must comment on it. Every channel must give us the latest news, even if it's just speculation. Countries and prominent individuals have to make official statements or be charged with being soft on terrorism. All the lives being snuffed out by the Western imperialists don't matter. But these in Paris do. That's the real message. Needless to say, we Marxists have no ideological affinity to Al-Qaeda, if that's who the attackers really were. On the other hand, the US and European imperialists have no problem in principle with Muslim fundamentalists, if they're like those who run some of the oil-rich states in the Middle East. No matter how much women may be oppressed or they virtually imprison immigrant workers, if they protect the imperialist interests, then they're okay. How does someone right now living in a Muslim or Middle Eastern country feel about the furor raised over the attack on Charlie Hebdo, the French magazine? Can they possibly not see this double standard in the media and politics of the so-called free democratic world? Think about the Palestinians, for example. They're not for Al-Qaeda, but they must be saying, where was this level of anger and condemnation when Gaza was being bombed every single day last summer by the Israelis? Don't our lives matter? It took more than 2,000 Palestinian deaths, including more than 500 children, to arouse some sympathy in the capitalist media. So that's one aspect of this development that just happened. Another is the issue of free speech. which is being raised to pass off degrading images of oppressed people as satire. We've recently seen the same thing here in the U.S. government's defense of the film The Interview, which not only is grossly insulting to the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but encourages murdering him by treating his fictional assassination as a laughing matter. And the State Department actually worked with Sony on shaping that film, by the way. At one time, and to some extent still, but not as much, racist, sexist, and homophobic images in this country were the norm, especially in the so-called entertainment industry. And so, by the way, was the practice of making so-called jokes about disabled people. Remember that? They were called sick jokes. It has taken many, many struggles to make it clear that cartoons, jokes, ads, and movies that perpetuate degrading stereotypes of oppressed people will not be tolerated. This didn't happen because of official government censorship. It happened because of countless protests and boycotts. Now, I don't know firsthand about the situation in France, but I do know that far-right parties there and in other parts of Europe are openly attacking immigrants, especially from Islamic countries, in a style reminiscent of the KKK here. Not only Islamic countries either. Roma people also are under attack, and some from Eastern Europe too. Poor people, in other words. Any culture that feeds into this bias is reactionary, no matter what it calls itself. One question we need to ask about the massacre that just happened at the newspaper Charlie Hebdo is, who gains politically from it? I think it seems pretty obvious that this event strengthens Islamophobia and anti-immigrant forces, not just in France, but throughout Europe and the US. We don't know if the story put out by the police is true or not. One person that they had claimed was the third man has turned himself in, probably fearing that otherwise he could be shot on sight by the cops. He proved that he was in school at the time that this happened. And what about the identity card supposedly found by the French police in the getaway vehicle? Does that really fit in with the military-type precision of these assailants? We need to have an open mind and not just accept the police story. You always have to take into account who benefits from such an act. The classic case was the Reichstag fire in 1933, an arson fire that burned part of the German parliament building. The Nazis blamed the fire on a young communist, and this was the excuse to launch a bloody attack on the left and the German working class, which accompanied Hitler's rise to power. Right-wing groups are again on the rise in Europe. They are blaming the continent's growing economic woes on immigrants and trying to turn the anger of the workers and small shopkeepers against foreigners. It is these same foreigners. These foreigners come from the same countries that were plundered during colonialism. Europe grew wealthy on their backs. But colonial rule reduced them to poverty and underdevelopment, which has lasted right through the neo-colonial era today. Most of the world is still dictated to by the imperialist banks. This is what has forced so many in Europe and Africa and Asia, to leave their homes and look for work in Europe. What the European workers need to know is that their problems come from capitalism, not from immigrants. Which brings me to the second topic of my talk. What is going on in the capitalist economy? I'm going to focus on the decline in oil prices. This is affecting people and whole countries in many different, diverse ways, depending on whether they're consumers of oil or producers of oil. Here in the U.S., cheaper gasoline and fuel oil can come as a welcome relief to workers who need to drive cars and heat their homes with oil. But oil-producing countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, on the other hand, depend on revenues from state-owned oil companies to balance their budgets. On top of that, they are suffering from U.S.-imposed economic sanctions. I know that at first it might have seemed that the drop in world oil prices was a deliberate move by the U.S. in an effort to actually bring down the countries that it has targeted. But there are two arguments against that view. First, the drop in oil prices has gone on for 6 months, so that the current benchmark price is less than $50 a barrel, half of what it was just 6 months ago. Yesterday's Times reported that in parts of North Dakota, because of a shortage of pipelines and the distance to major markets, I'm quoting them, the Bakken shale producers this month, so far, are selling their crude for as little as $34 a barrel. This shale oil, which comes from fracking, is among the most expensive oil to produce. They are selling at a loss. Something they don't like to do. And it is having a profound impact on the profits of U.S. oil companies and their plans for the future. A price this low hurts the U.S. domestic oil industry even more than others, particularly in the Middle East. This is because U.S. oil companies in recent years have enormously expanded their oil and gas production through fracking, tar sands, and offshore oil. These methods of extraction cost much more than just pumping up oil from underground lakes of the stuff that may exist, and which used to exist in this country, but are pretty depleted now. When the energy companies began investing in these newer forms of oil and gas extraction, they had to sink hundreds of billions of dollars into the newer technologies. Just last year alone, some $200 billion, 1/5 of all the private fixed structures investment in the United States was spent by the oil and gas industry. From the point of view of the environment, of course, this didn't make any sense at all, right? Put more carbon into the atmosphere so our children will inherit the biggest climate disaster humanity has ever faced. But from the point of view of profits, it seemed to make perfect sense to the oil companies. But there was just one problem. It would be immensely profitable, but only as long as the oil extracted could be sold at a high price. $80 a barrel has been considered the level at which the oil companies could sell their product and be assured of a profit. Anything earned above that would be gravy, but below that, and now it's below $50 and even $34 in North Dakota, they are losing money. So they put a huge amount of money into developing these new oil fields. So much that in just a few years, the U.S. has changed from being a net importer of oil to be the biggest oil and gas producer in the world. Just last year, this country's output outstripped Saudi Arabia and Russia, the next largest producers. But at the same time, the long-awaited recovery from the 2008 and 2009 economic crisis did not go very deep. In the U.S., real unemployment, that's including the people who are working only part-time and those who have given up looking for work, is still very high. Wages have not recovered, as you all know. People just can't buy much, not as much as they used to. In Europe, there's continuing low growth and even what they call negative growth, which is another way of saying recession or depression in much of the continent. Even China, whose strong economy did buoy up the capitalist world for a while, has been cutting back. So here's all this oil, more than ever, and along with it, declining demand. It is a classic situation of capitalist overproduction. Perhaps the strategists for the oil companies thought they could pressure the Saudis and others in OPEC to reduce their oil output and thereby keep the prices up. Certainly, there's been all kinds of pressures put on them to do exactly that. But it has not happened. Production by both OPEC and the U.S. continues to increase even as oil prices continue to go down. Just yesterday, the New York Times reported that an announcement by Helmerich and Payne, the giant contract oil rig company, said it planned to idle up to 50 rigs over the next month, and that this, they say, quote, sent shudders through the industry. And that came on top of 11 rigs that it has already mothballed, meaning that in just a few weeks, its shale drilling activity will be reduced by about 20%. Now, in this country, about 1 million people work in the oil industry, and already thousands are being laid off. Which comes to the second reason why you can't say that this is a manufactured crisis. As much as the ruling class would like to be able to manipulate the market so as to ensure a never-ending supply of profits to them, it just can't be done. Capitalism cannot be controlled, not even by the capitalists. Capitalism is not a planned economy. There's planning in it, of course. Capitalist enterprises make all kinds of plans, always to enhance their growth and their profits, they hope. But underlying it all is the basic contradiction between private ownership of the means of production and their ever-increasing social character of production. Private ownership, by its very nature, means competition. Each capitalist or group of capitalists strives to expand, to dominate more and more of the market. They are compelled to expand or die. Those who are successful amass more capital and continue their growth. The others are driven out. Friedrich Engels, the closest collaborator of Karl Marx, described the boom and bust cycle of capitalism 135 years ago in his book Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. He described how this lust for markets and profit goes from first a trot to a canter to a full all-out gallop, only, as he said, to end up in the ditch of a capitalist crisis of overproduction. The only difference now from then is that these crises have become worldwide, as economic life on all the continents is connected through not only the exchange of goods and services, but also the financial architecture that holds it all together. And that is riddled with contradictions. Not the least is the huge amount of debt, which suppresses rational economic development in much of the world and can drown the workers and much of the middle class in times of crisis. But why should the oppressed countries, whose natural resources and labor have fattened the imperialists for so long, Why should they owe anything to these parasites? Why should the workers of the world, who make everything, why should they owe 1 penny to the banks, the landlords, and the finance companies who don't produce anything, right? If any one commodity can be called the lifeblood of capitalism, it is oil. The unfolding crisis cannot be contained and is sure to impact the workers and oppressed peoples all over the world. Our fate cannot be left in the hands of the capitalist rulers who would and have killed off millions of workers in their endless quest for more profits. Surely the world is overripe for a social earthquake that can free up society's wealth for the good of the people. That adjustment can only come through the revolutionary activity of the masses themselves, fighting for a socialist system that cancels these fictitious debts, shuts down the stock exchanges and the other places that speculate on the wealth that the workers produce, and begins the joyous task of focusing economic activity back on what it should be doing, meeting human needs. As the signs in the youthful militant demonstrations against police murders say, tear down the whole system. The discussion was very, very interesting because of the scope that it presented, of showing how the imperialist media completely ignore when massacres are carried out by their agents to further their ends in so many countries around the world. And just in this audience, we have so many people who come from the struggle in many parts of the world. So it really came out in this meeting how not only does that happen all the time, but there's an awareness about it that this is, that they're covering up, and that when they want to make your hearts bleed, you better watch out because they have some ulterior motive for it. And of course, people have always felt terrible about anybody being killed and so on, and they know how to play on that, but for their own political ends, which are imperialist ends and capitalist ends. And then the other point was on this question of the declining oil prices, and how, I think Steve put it correctly, that it has been an element of imperialist strategy to take advantage of that in relationship to countries like Iran, Venezuela, Russia in particular, maybe others as well. However, that can sort of hide the essence of what's going on. I mean, on the point that Jim raised too, that earlier in U.S. history, when the oil industry was just beginning, and the Rockefellers were, dominating the production in many parts of the country, they actually used a tactic from time to time to drive a competitor out by lowering the price of oil where that competitor existed. I think they were much bigger. They had the ability to do that in one part of their empire while still continuing to make profits in the rest of their empire, but they could drive somebody out. And to a certain extent, that's what the imperialists would like to be able to do now with OPEC. They would like to do that with OPEC. But you know that old saying, be careful what you wish for, because it may come back to bite you. I think this is a deeper crisis than that, much deeper. And that, yes, they will always they'll use anything. I mean, they'll use wars, especially, of course. Even wars that, kill their own troops. They'll use wars to further their ends. But this is a crisis that goes to the situation that U.S. imperialism finds itself in at the present time. Big productive capacity, still the predominant economic force in the world, but reaching a point where its own internal contradictions contradictions of the system are catching up. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to understand that it could go much deeper. I don't mean to say that they're going to, that oil prices might not recover a little bit, or that oil stocks, which have dropped in value, might come back up in value. We can't predict stuff like that. But we can see the broad trend, and the broad trend is toward another crisis of overproduction, and this is the biggest symptom of it so far.